Hello there friends, Anthony Turnham here, and in this video what I want to do is just talk with you about finishing photos, as in putting the polish on your work. In front of me we've got the raw version of a shot I took at Tomato Peak in New Zealand. Now I would have loved to have been here at sunrise or sunset, but unfortunately I was there when I was there and this is what I had to work with. And I was looking at this little patch of light that was always changing as the cloud was moving across, but I thought that was actually really interesting and I was relatively happy with my composition. However, I wasn't really happy with this color version. I really wanted to transform it into a black and white, something really nice and punchy, so we got a nice bright highlight here contrasting with the shadows. So I did a little bit of a conversion, and initially it looked like this. And as you can see, we're all blown out in the sky, and I did some luminosity blending to create another version which looked like this, and now we've got all the detail in the black and white. And I also added what I call just a bit of a look, and although it doesn't look like much making these changes, there's quite a bit going on here just with levels and contrast and things like that. And in terms of a black and white, you might just say, I'm done with this, I'm happy. But me being me, I always like to see what else I can do with my photos. And sometimes when I'm working in Photoshop, it's just a bit of a creative roadblock. If you don't know exactly what you want to do, it's quite hard to actually start making changes. I've played around with a bit of dodging and burning and things like this, and I'm not really getting the look that I want. And so what I'm going to do is open it up in what I consider to be one of the absolute best plugins for Photoshop, and that is Luminar AI. So now we have the image inside of Luminar AI. It exists as a 16-bit TIFF file. I'm also working in the Pro Photo color space as well. So look, even though this is a black and white image, basically I'm covering myself by working with as much bit depth and data in this file as I possibly can. Now, those of you familiar with Luminar will know that I could have done this edit right from the ground up inside of Luminar AI, because it is, of course, a photo editor in its own right. We've got all our access to the usual kind of editing tools, as well as all the AI tools. But it's the creative section within Luminar AI which is really calling to me. And the reason for that is I can make some changes to this photo really, really quickly and just see what I like the look of. Like I said, I was a little bit stumped inside of Photoshop. So one thing I do want to do is actually create a sun flare. And if I just sort of toggle this off for a second, you can see that up here, we've actually got, just out of frame would be the sun. So basically the sun's coming down, lighting this area here. And while I like this look as it is at the moment, I really feel like perhaps some light rays coming through, the sun's beautiful rays coming through the image, would actually add something to this photo. So let's go ahead and turn this back on and position it where we need to. So we'll click the Place Sun Center and bring that up here. So as you can see, I don't need to have it in frame. And just in case you've never used or seen this tool before, how cool is this that as I move this around, it basically interacts with the brightness levels in your scene as well. So it sort of disappears behind the darker clouds and then reappears where it's bright. Years back, I actually created a how to create light rays in Photoshop tutorial. Man, it's time consuming. The fact that you can just do this inside of Luminar AI with a tool like this is, yeah, just blows my mind. But currently, we've got some work to do to make this look believable and tie it in. So what I want to do is come down to the warmth, because currently we've got yellow or orange in the warmth of the sun rays, and we want that gone because obviously we're dealing with a black and white photo. The penetration amount, as I play with that there, that's basically saying how much will that light penetrate through the darker clouds. And I don't really want it to be going too forcefully through the clouds, so I'm just going to drop that back just a little bit. I'm not too concerned about the sun rays length at the moment, because what I want to do is actually fine tune this with one of Luminar's masks, which I'll show you in a moment, which is really easy to do as well. The sun settings here actually talk to the actual glowing area around this part here as well, and I don't really want to push that too high, but we certainly want to have that feeling of a little bit of flare coming in. We can play with the radius as well, so we can have that smaller or larger, and then once we've got it the way we want it to look, we can actually just dial that back slightly. Now we get into a bit where we have a little bit more fine control over the actual rays themselves. So we can play with the number of rays. You can see as I move this around, we can actually be really sort of specific and create some really hard-edged rays coming through. And depending on the scene that you're working on, will depend how many rays you actually want coming through. Usually I quite like setting the number of rays to 0, and I find that actually creates a more realistic effect once it's painted in. You can use the randomize slider, and that's just going to give you a whole heap of different random options. So you can see there randomization 22. The light is actually coming through pretty much into the sweet spot of this image. Sure, we're bleeding out to the right and the left, and maybe we do want a little bit of that. And also we're sort of feathering off down here, which is probably a little bit too much, because the feeling is that these rays would be coming down and lighting this patch through here. So now what I'm going to do is just actually grab the mask, and using quite a low opacity, maybe somewhere around that sort of 20 mark, I'm just going to paint this effect in only where I want it. So I can use the right bracket keys, left bracket keys to increase or decrease the size of my brush. Or what I'm actually doing, which you won't see, is I'm using my toolbox at the moment, which is all, you just turn a little knob, and as you turn that, basically it changes the size of the brush, and I really love that. Somebody did actually mention to me the other day in the comments, does the toolbox work with Luminar AI? Absolutely it does. It works with Photoshop, it works with Lightroom, basically any creative program. So I also have to cut these videos together for you guys, and it also works with Adobe Premiere as well. If you are interested in looking at the toolbox at all, I've got a link to the video which I will put up in the top right hand corner and the description as well. Alright, so hopefully you can see that I can just paint that effect in pretty much exactly where I want it. So if I turn this off and then I turn it back on, you can see that we're just adding those beams of light. And one of the things that I like to do once I've got my mask as I want it, and I've got the overall look of the filter, the effect, is then you can grab the amount slider and you can just remove it, and then just sort of start to bring it into a place where you feel like you're happy with it for your creative vision. You know, like up where it was before, around 90, it was a bit of overkill really. It was just a bit too much, but for your creative aesthetic, that might be exactly what you're after. But I want to go with something that's just sort of a little bit more believable. I think I'll keep it quite high because I like what it's doing coming through the clouds here, but it's just bleaching out the contrast of this shadow area a little bit. So I'm just going to get my mask again, this time come to the eraser, increase the size of the brush, and I'm just going to click, and I'm just going to paint that away. Just a little bit off of the land itself. So now we're getting more of that effect in the sky and less of it on the land. One tool that often works really well with the sun rays is actually the Atmosphere AI tool, and what that does is actually just drop in some fog or haze into your image. So I'm going to just go for some layered fog, and I'm going to crank the amount to 100. And I always recommend working pretty heavy-handedly with these tools, and then that allows you to see exactly what they're doing, and then you can remove them or decrease the amount afterwards, either with a mask or just that overall amount. You can bring it back down. And the reason we're not really seeing too much at the moment is because our depth is quite low. So basically this layered fog, it will be doing something off in the distance, but you'll see as I bring this there we go. As I bring this forward here, you can see that we're starting to get some layered fog just sitting in the valley. And that's all done with AI masking. Very clever, like nothing's going on up on the peaks up here. It's all happening down in these lower areas. So that's pretty cool. Because that's happening through this area that I'd already darkened down when I did my initial work in Photoshop, I'm just going to bring the lightness of that down, bring the depth back a little bit, and now just wiggle this amount slider back and forth and just sort of get a feel for that where I want it. All right, let's go somewhere like that. And I'm just going to use my mask, and I'm just going to erase the fog just from sort of around the edge, because I want to keep a sort of darkened vignette effect just around the edge. So I don't really want to brighten that up too much. So I'll just quickly paint this in here, and that's going to keep that fog effect more here, more centrally. Let's turn this off, turn it on. It's pretty subtle, but I'll leave that there. if I do feel like our eyes are just kind of going a little bit all over the place in this image, and I do feel that, like my intention was to sort of have this interest part here on this right hand third basically framed by this hillside here and then this little interesting dude here. I just wanted this to all frame this area nicely, but I do feel like we're getting lost a little bit. So I'm going to try putting a vignette on this. So again, let's go heavy handed. We don't want to brighten the edges. What I want to do is darken them down. I might bring the size in slightly. And if you come into the advanced settings, what you can do is just feather the vignette off so it's just got a smoother transition. That always helps with that level of believability. And let me turn this off and turn it on. Yeah, I quite like that. I like that darkening effect around the edges. That is helping me with the vision I was kind of going for. And one of the really cool things that I like about this that you can't do in tools like Lightroom is basically you can control where your subject of the vignette is. So I can actually click in the scene and pinpoint where I want the center of the vignette. And I think that is really neat. So I can say that this is the area of interest for my photo and darken off everywhere else. Now, I don't normally jump into the landscape section when I'm working with a black and white, but let me do that. Let me grab the dehaze and just see what happens. Turning it off and on. I actually like the fact that that's bringing back quite a bit of contrast into the image. I think what I'll do is just paint it in more around the central part of the photo itself, because as you know, our eye will go to areas of contrast. And again, I'm just trying to say to people, look here, this is the interesting part of the photo. So let me toggle that off and toggle it on. Yep, I like that. In my very last video, I explained all the different color tools inside of Luminar AI. So again, if you want to check that out, there's a link up in the top corner or in the description below. But one of the things I did mention was that if you're working on a black and white photo, you're not restricted just to either color or black and white. What you can actually do is tone your photos. So if I grab this highlight saturation slider, what we can do is actually bring a color into the highlights. We can use the hue to actually change that. So if we wanted to go a little bit old school and create a kind of sepia look, we can do that. So an original black and white, bit of sepia. You can also introduce a complementary color into the shadows. So for example, if I crank the saturation up a bit and then bring this into the blues, and there you go, we've got a nice split tone between an orange in the highlights, blues in the shadow. Toggle that off, toggle that on. You might not want to have it in a full effect, but you might just say, I just want a little bit of a hint of this, just so it's not a flat black and white. You've just got a really soft, subtle toning going on. I'm not going to do that because what I like to do when I'm creating my black and whites is sell them as sets on my landscape photography site. And if I have some which are toned, some which aren't, they're just not going to tie in. So for now, I'm just going to turn that off. The matte tool is really cool. It can create that nice muted kind of look, which is very popular on things like Instagram and has been for a long time now. But it just doesn't seem to be going away. People do like this. For me, for my landscape work, it's not really an option, but this is a really good tool for working with portraits. I'm not going to worry about using any of that at the moment. But one thing I do want to do is come into the mystical filter here. And I actually really like introducing this filter because it just helps to give your landscape imagery a certain quality that you just can't really explain. You know, it's softening things up, but not to the extent that it's blurring things. It's also adding more contrast. I find it hard to describe the look, but I actually really like that. In Photoshop, I brought back a lot of the details in the bushes here and this dude here, the grass and everything. And that can start to look a little bit too crunchy, almost like HDR-like. And I find that using the mystical filter is a really nice way to sort of counteract that. So you've still got the detail there. If you were to zoom in, and then this gets printed out, you've got all of this lovely detail, but it's not as kind of crunchy and hard as it was if I turn this off and turn it on. This mystical filter just does a nice job of introducing contrast and just softening things off. Just like with all the tools, a little goes a long way. I don't want to blitz it at 100% or anywhere near that amount, but I just want to sort of tease that in. You've got tools that do a similar effect with inside of the glow. So things like soft focus, you know, that can work quite nicely. High key is also a very good option for black and white as well, if that's a look that you're going for. And I might ease a little bit of that in. And we also have the option to work with super contrast as well. And that does things like just brings back our highlights if we've sort of overexposed those. So that actually could be quite a good option for us here, just so we're keeping detail and interest in this hillside here. We can work with the midtones as well if we want to. And I actually do want to just bring those midtones down just a little bit. And here, by bringing this shadow contrast up, we're getting more detail in the shadow. But for this image, that's not what I want. I said I was going to stick with the creative tools, but honestly, Luminar AI, it gives you options that are so easy to play around with, like the accent AI filter. I could introduce some of that if I want to. Structure is a really powerful tool as well, and with black and whites as well, all you've got to play with are the tones within the image. And so for us, I think maybe if we introduce some structure, I'm going to paint this in just into sort of this area here and then feather it off. So with an opacity around that 28 mark again, I am just going to sort of click and paint and build up this effect. So it's more intense in the center of the frame, a little bit up in the cloud as well. And let's toggle this off and on. And just as one last sort of finishing thing, so I could take a little bit more control over my image, I can actually come back into all of this stuff. I'm kind of working a bit back to front, to be honest, today. Normally I'd make all of my editing and changes in this essential section first. I always want to say essential selection. Taking me back to my youth listening to Pete Tong on the radio with the essential selection. Anyway, I'm going back to front today. So I want to come back into the light section. And if I want to, I can actually control the curves myself, like, control the contrast, make this more of a dark and broody image. And that's looking pretty good to me. If I look at my before, this is what I brought in from Photoshop. And at that point, I was pretty happy with it, but I just didn't know where I was really going to be going with it other than try and put in some sun rays. So this is our Luminar edit. This was our Photoshop edit, which I feel now looking at it was just starting to look a little bit flat. There's a lot of detail in this image, but I feel like it doesn't really have a particularly good tonal range through the whole thing. We've tied things together a little bit nicer. And I really feel like my eye is drawn to this area in the center of the frame much more. I love looking at this area where the light beams are coming through. I certainly want to linger with my eye over where the light is coming down. And the fact that we've got this dude nice and visible there, I really like that. I hadn't done any sharpening inside of Photoshop, so now I'm just going to crank up a little bit of sharpening. Zoom in and just check I'm happy with what Luminar AI is doing. So this is with the sharpening off, and that's with it on. And as I look at the grass, that's looking lovely and sharp. It might just be a little bit overdone, so let's bring that down just a little bit. And checking the background as well. This is with 0 sharpening straight from the sensor. And that's with Luminar's sharpening just set at 41. One of my favorite things about Luminar AI is, as well as sort of seeing where we've come from and where we've got to, which is a really nice way to do things and just check that you're happy with the edit you've made. But as well as that, you've actually got the option to, rather than just say, I want all of this edit or none of it, you've actually got a slider down here in the bottom right, which actually allows you to control the overall amount of the effect that you've created. So if we step away from our monitor, go and grab a drink, and then come back and go, whoa, I've really overcooked that. You can grab this slider, and rather than having to go into each individual tool and reduce it like you would with, say, Lightroom, you can actually just grab this overall slider and just bring it back to a point where you feel you're happy with. So for example, I may feel like, yeah, I overdid it at 100% and just bring it back to somewhere around 80%. And I really love that feature. These changes I made here for this black and white, I could save these out as my own template to use again in the future. I've actually done that for my architectural photography because I found that there's a very deliberate approach I take in terms of doing my initial edit in Lightroom, sending it out to Photoshop, doing any luminosity masking and retouching. And then when I've done all of that, I get Luminar to batch process the whole set of images for that. So in terms of a piece of software that you can either use as a complete editor or as I often like to do, as a plugin for Photoshop or Lightroom. I thoroughly recommend it, and I do have a link below with a discount code if you guys want to get hold of that. My discount code is @Sky10. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and thank you for supporting the channel. If you've enjoyed this, give me a little thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Do let me know if you've got any questions in the comments, guys, and I'll see you in the next video, which conveniently YouTube will be making a suggestion for you right now.